So welcome everybody. This session is as posted, Disaster Response and Resiliency. We hope to share some insights with you on both of those topics, our responding activities, probably talk about a little bit about recovery and some mitigation as well along the way in our journey today. I'm Scott Graham. I'm with the American Red Cross. I'm a Division Disaster Executive in the Mid-Atlantic Division of our organization, which means I'm overseeing disasters in South Carolina and Pennsylvania. We've got a number of colleagues here that are in the room from several different agencies, and I'll be introducing our panel and speakers here in just a moment. But what we'd like to do is conduct this session in three parts. We're going to do some overview presentations on some of our recent experiences. The last several years, as some of the speakers spoke this morning about, have been pretty intense times. Hurricanes, wildfires, a number of large-scale disasters, some of which unfortunately have befallen Georgia in that time frame as well. So we'll each speak to that a little bit. Then we're going to have a quick panel discussion on a topic. And then I'd really like to make sure that we have some time to have you guys ask questions and for us to come back with some answers. We'll answer the questions. If you want to direct them to one of our panelists directly or their agency, that'd be great. If you'd like to just have a general conversation about a question, that's great too. So whichever way works best for you as somebody who'd like to engage with us towards the end. So we'll do this in three pieces. The next part is just a quick introduction. The bios for our panelists are all posted on the website. So I'm going to keep this pretty brief just to give you a sense, though, of who's on our team today. And it is a team for us. So our first speaker this morning will be Sarah Jackson. Sarah is the Community Partnership Manager for the Georgia Emergency Management Agency and Homeland Security. She's helping to build resilience across Georgia as part of her responsibilities. Jennifer Pippa is with the American Red Cross, and she is our regional executive here in the state of Georgia. Georgia is a one-region state, so she covers your entire great state. She's been involved in a number of disasters over the years, but more recently, Irma and Michael and Maria. Jesse Munoz is our third speaker, and Jesse's from the Federal Emergency Management Agency here based in Atlanta with Fema Region 4. Jesse is the Director of Mitigation for Fema Region 4. So those are our panelists today. They'll walk you through some presentations, and then we will take a quick interlude to have some conversation among us as a panel, and then we'll come back to you guys and see what questions you'd like to pose to us. So without further ado, I'd like to move to the first slide on our first presentation, and Sarah Jackson. Sarah?
Hi everyone, like he said, my name is Sarah Jackson. I am representing Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency. So moving forward, that will just be GEMA for everyone. Make that a little easier. So since I'm the first presenter, I wanted to go ahead and give a little context about how emergency management functions in our state and kind of across sectors. First off, our mission at GEMA is the protection of life and property against both man-made and natural disasters by directing our resources and efforts in the areas of prevention, preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. So kind of the basics of the disaster cycle. So I work within the recovery side of that, so I'll kind of be presenting with that lens. But I also want to kind of emphasize that central to all of that is coordination and communication. So our agency, we have about 125 to 130 full-time employees. So when we're responding to a disaster and doing recovery, our partners and coordination with partners and agencies is really critical to accomplishing what we accomplish. So we're really the kind of the connectors and coordinators and communicators. And I think that this kind of image really demonstrates that. So this is our emergency support functions. So during a major event or impending disaster, we will activate most, if not all, of our emergency support function annexes. And so basically, they're used to coordinate interagency support. So like, if a major hurricane is coming in, we will be activated at our state operations center. And so what that looks like is all of our different partners come into the room, and we have representation from transportation, so Department of Transportation. We have representation kind of handling public health and response around that, and that's going to be led by Department of Public Health. And so GMA is really just bringing these players in and making sure they're coordinating and making sure our response is effective and efficient. And then also, I want to give a little context and kind of how this works between, working between the state, federal, Red Cross, nonprofits. So basically, I've walked into a lot of trainings, and even when I started at GMA, this was something that was kind of pounded into me, that all disasters start and end locally. So that means that when there's a disaster, and especially in a home rule state like Georgia, where emergency managers and counties, they function kind of independently of the state, so we're just there to support them. When there is an event, they're the ones who are handling it at the local level, and it's only when it goes beyond their capacity at the local level does GMA come in. So they'll put in a resource request or personnel request, and that's when we step up. Okay, so likewise with FEMA, it's only when it's beyond the capacity of the local and state level that FEMA comes in and assists. So that's when you kind of hear about if it's a major event in the state that will have a Georgia state of emergency, so that activates our state operations center and Georgia emergency operations plan. And likewise, at the federal level, if it's a big enough event and it hits a certain threshold of impact, that's when we're gonna have a presidential declaration. And then I also wanna emphasize that businesses, nonprofits, and faith-based organizations are really integral at every level of that. So they're providing resources and support at every level, and Red Cross can speak to that. They're at the local, state, and federal level, and I'm gonna really talk about that a little more, so I wanted to go ahead and emphasize that. I also want to touch on what the new normal in Georgia has been. I think we heard a lot of great information during our plenary, so I won't dive into it too much. I think especially those of us who live in Georgia have experienced the last 3 years. But in the context of what that's mean for resources, well, prior to 2016, I believe we only had one federally declared disaster for a hurricane. In the last 3 years, we had 3 declared disasters for a hurricane. So that means FEMA resources were deployed. We also had 2 tornado events in the last 3 years. So as you can see, hurricane recovery by the numbers, luckily that means that FEMA could deploy resources, and they deployed significant resources. So that's $32 million for individual assistance, $260 million for public assistance, just for those 3 hurricanes in Georgia. But what I want to kind of focus on is what happens when that's not enough. That seems like a lot of resources, but you'd be surprised by the magnitude of this impact, what it takes to really help rebuild a community. So I put a question mark for nonprofit assistance, just because that's really an immeasurable impact and support that they provide across the state. It wouldn't be enough for just GMA or just FEMA to be deploying resources. It's a whole entire community effort to rebuild a community and recover. So I want to look like when that FEMA assistance and when GMA's deploying those resources, when that's not enough, they do a lot, and it would be critical. It's critical to have those resources to rebuild a community, but still inevitably people fall through the cracks. So the most vulnerable Georgians are often hit the hardest by disasters, exacerbating poverty and inequity. So who can potentially fall through the cracks? Well, you're looking at people that are already living in poverty. They're living paycheck by paycheck. She referenced this before, but these are people that don't know if they're going to be able to turn their lights on the next month. They don't know if they can pay their bills or if they're going to have enough food on the table. They're not preparing for a disaster, so when a disaster does hit, it can really take them off their feet. And so yes, there's FEMA assistance and GMA steps in, but they don't always know how to access those. So think about people who speak English as a second language and are trying to navigate that system. Sometimes a survivor lives in a county that there wasn't a declaration, meaning those resources, they're not eligible for them, even though they were impacted. There are people who aren't eligible for FEMA assistance but are still fighting with insurance agencies or can't find contractors in more rural areas. And then in, for example, places like Albany, when they get hit by a second storm in a matter of years and they didn't do those proper repairs to their home, they're hit even harder. And sometimes assistance simply isn't enough, so I crunched some of the numbers, and the individual assistance on average provided to Georgians following these hurricanes was about $2,000. And sometimes, while that's a great start and they need those fundings, it's not going to be enough to make up for the loss of their salary if their business was closed during those times, or unemployment, or the cost of sheltering or having to evacuate. And of course, there are programs that help with that, but a lot of times individuals don't know how to access them. So, like I said, this isn't to minimize the resources provided by FEMA and administered through GMA, but it's really just focusing on the fact that recovery involves a lot more than just those efforts. So that's where, So that's where my job comes in. So my job is to be the voluntary agency liaison to nonprofits who are active in disaster across the state. So I primarily work through an organization called Georgia VOAD, and that's really a collective of organizations that are active in disaster. So that's Red Cross. We work very closely with them. Salvation Army and Spiritus. They're providing all sorts of resources, those wraparound resources that we're not providing with FEMA assistance that can fill those gaps, that can provide help with housing, that can help with repairs if the assistance wasn't enough, or they're having issues with insurance, or they don't have insurance at all. They're helping, sending volunteers to clean up, and so on. So in these last 3 years, if GMA has really learned anything, is that we need to be working more closely with these nonprofits to coordinate with them, to one, ensure there's not duplication of efforts, but also to make sure we're really supporting them and making sure they're plugging into existing resources that the state provides or that FEMA provides. We really need to be working with them closely because they have huge impact on individuals' lives and their abilities to be resilient. So I mentioned before, and we're kind of looping back around, that all disasters start and end locally. So for long-term recovery, this is incredibly true. And I just want to kind of preface by saying long-term recovery isn't super sexy. This is like well beyond when the media has left. This is beyond after people stop sending donations. This is the nitty-gritty work of getting people back on their feet, and it takes a long time. So for example, after Hurricane Matthew, the coast, they're just wrapping up cases. That was 3 years ago. And in other communities outside of Georgia, I mean, it takes much longer than that. So it's really important, and we've found for communities to be resilient, that they have this infrastructure on the ground of nonprofit coalitions that are already working together and planning and prepared to help their communities get back on their feet. So I'm not going to dive too far into this just for the sake of time, but some success stories around that would be a long-term recovery group that popped up in coastal Georgia, so the Coastal Empire Disaster Recovery Committee. And basically what they do is they bring the players at the table, the Salvation Army and Spiritus, United Methodist, United Way, and they come together and they identify the unmet needs across the community. So somebody comes in and they identify a need saying they need help with roofing. They didn't get enough FEMA assistance to repair their roof. Well, this is a perfect way to make sure that the resources are deployed effectively. So if one organization says, hey, I have funding for that, well, another organization might say, well, actually, we have volunteers that could do that roofing. So that means the other organization who had the funding, they can use that and apply it to another person that needs actually paid assistance to help and professional assistance to help with their rebuild. So it helped 2 households instead of just 1. So there's just kind of an example of what that success looks like, and that's hundreds of cases. And this is something that will always look different in different communities, rural versus more populated areas like Savannah. But kind of the concept is always the same. When we bring these players together and we're working collaboratively and we're prepared to help people, it can be very effective. So what about the rest of the state? Well, right now we only have about 10 to 15 active long-term recovery groups or community organizations who are active in disaster working collectively. There's a lot of dormant ones. So this is where GMA comes in our new community recovery department. So We established our community recovery department in July of this year. And I have my coworkers here. We have a department manager and an individual assistance manager, and then myself who's working with the nonprofits. And so moving forward, we're really working on connecting these local communities and these nonprofits to resources that they haven't tapped into before, training and providing cross-sector training and exercises to build capacity and maintain engagement, and then also support. So support to develop locally led coalitions, like the example I gave, that can help with preparedness and the recovery efforts. So ultimately with the goal to build more resilient communities. And of course, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't do a little call to action. So I just kind of implore you to think about how you could be getting involved at the local level. So that's really where you're going to be the most effective. And I know a lot of you work for universities. That's a great opportunity to partner with these nonprofits who are doing this work, but also your local government. So just think about it. Or reach out to me if you're interested.
Next, we'll hear from Jennifer Pippa here in the Red Cross in Georgia. Jennifer?
Good afternoon. Okay. There we go. So I wanted to just start with our mission statement so you kind of know what drives us and how we deliver our mission each and every day. So our goal is to alleviate human suffering in the face of disasters, and we do that in a couple of different ways. We do that by mobilizing the power of volunteers, and we do it by the generosity of the donors and the American public as they support as we deliver our mission each and every day. We are a volunteer-supported organization. It is not possible for us to deliver the Red Cross mission across the U.S. or here in Georgia unless we had a volunteer cadre that's trained and ready to go at a moment's notice. We have less than 100 staff that support the Georgia Red Cross across the entire state. 90% of what we do is going to be done through volunteers. It's the only way that we can deliver our mission each and every day. So what I want to talk about a little bit is rapid intensification and more risk as we're coming along. So these are just two very, very current examples of what we're seeing. So Hurricane Harvey, right, this was one that kind of sat out there in the Gulf, spun around a little bit, and then sat over Houston for like 48 hours and just dumped copious amounts of rain. Now, just recently, we've had Imelda, the exact same area. It goes through Galveston, into Houston, into that Beaumont area. It's the same folks being impacted time and time again. And so what we've started talking about is things like repetitive loss. Right? So you lost your house or you were flooded during Harvey, and now you've had the same thing happen yet again, just a year or two later. The same thing happened with Michael and Nestor. So that came up through the Gulf. Michael was a very, very small storm, did not look like it was going to be a huge threat. If you looked back about 4 days pre-landfall, all of a sudden, massive intensification, huge strengthening, and then it just came through. It walloped part of the panhandle of Florida. And then who in Georgia, in the southwest Georgia area, is ready to be hit by a hurricane, right? That's a coastal issue, right? Or it had been historically. It's not anymore. So we have to look at things like that. Georgia, no different, right? Wildfires. We talked about drought in some of the plenary sessions, right? So Georgia's had wildfires before. We're still at risk for it now. And the wildfires that you see in California, these huge wildfires, which historically didn't start till the November, right? They're starting months earlier now that we're seeing, right? So for us, we're going back to the same places again, trying to support clients, not just with financial resources and connecting them to our partners, but we're providing a lot more mental health now because these are the same folks we're seeing in our shelters time and time again, experiencing the same disasters. And that adds a whole level of complexity when you start talking about how you support that community as they move from the response and into the recovery. So increasing risk, right? All you got to do is look at the chart. That black is our standard average, right? That's the last 3 years. So all you have to do is turn on the news nowadays, right? It's hurricane after hurricane after hurricane. It's flooding, it's wind-driven events, it's tornadoes, and it's wildfires. And we're seeing that increase year over year over year. And for something like a nonprofit, it challenges us in how we handle that and how we respond to that when we see larger more intense, longer duration storms, right? It means that your recovery time, which used to be just, maybe 6 weeks, you're now looking at significantly longer recovery times, which means that we're deploying human and material assets for much, much longer and running concurrent operations versus, in a sequence. So these are just a couple of numbers to try and kind of give you a baseline of where we're at. You're starting to look at millions of meals. You're looking at tens of thousands of mental health contacts. These are big storms, right? They are impacting huge amounts of our community, specifically along the coastlines. As we see populations migrating towards the coast, they're moving into higher risk areas. They may not have the historical knowledge of what evacuating looks like, of how to take that seriously, and what preparedness actions you need to take. So we're seeing a massive move to the coast, but they're not getting the education potentially that we need so that they can take these kinds of storms and spend a lot of time getting prepared and being ready to take care of themselves and their neighbors when something does happen. So a couple of things. It was interesting, we talked about some of the vulnerable communities. So one of the things we see in the American Red Cross is we don't always have trust into some of the communities that we absolutely need to get into to make sure that they're being supported. There are segments of our population that for various reasons will not come to a large, say, shelter facility and seek help and assistance, right? It's still our duty as a not-for-profit to make sure that everybody gets access to the same services. So we work through one of our initiatives now to gain community-based trust with community mobilizers, to help them transfer their trust of their community to us so that we make sure that they get the resources they need so that they can begin their recovery as well, and they're not being left out, they're not being forgotten. And so that's one of the major initiatives we've started to focus on in the last couple of years is identifying those segments of the community that may not present and how we get to them versus having them come to us. So what do, right? Longer storms, more intense, concurrent operations. That's a drain on our human and material resources. So we had to kind of step back and look at how we assess readiness now. So we have 4 lanes that we think about when we think about readiness. So one of them is trained people. We got to have volunteers that are ready to go, that know how to arrive on the ground and immediately set up a shelter, provide mental health, do damage assessments so we can understand scope and scale. Then we need good technology, right? Information is the key to unlocking all of the resources that we can deliver, not just for us, but for GEMA, for FEMA. We all have to share that information. We've got to be able to collect it, to analyze it, and to be able to present it in a way that we can make good choices to understand what the impact to the community is and then what we need to do in order to deliver that. So we have an entire lane that's dealt with data and infrastructure. The third one is necessary supplies, right? That's a basic one, probably the easiest. Enough cots, enough blankets, enough computers to enter the data, enough places for people to sleep, enough food, all of those components, doing an analysis of what we need to have kind of in the wings waiting at any moment in time so that we can support a national level response. And then the fourth is supportive community. So this is our sheltering agreements. So what we're seeing is nobody can respond to a disaster alone. It's not a Red Cross, it's not a GEMA, it's not a FEMA. It is a network of all of our partners together in order to support that community and make sure that they have a safe place to stay. This is where we say, if we look at the behavior of folks evacuating when a hurricane's going to come, we know that there's a segment of the population that's going to need sheltering. The Red Cross probably can't do it all, right? But we can do this much, right? And then we have a conversation with GEMA and we say, what can you do? And where do we find other partners? And how do we train other local community-based agencies so that they can open a shelter as well so that we can make sure that there are enough shelter spaces across the entirety of the state when someone needs to have a safe place to stay. So Hurricane Dorian. So in Georgia, what you'll hear people say is not a big impact, right? It didn't hit, it didn't make landfall. Here's what I'm going to tell you. First of all, to the 100+ people that lost their homes on the North Carolina coast, it was a major disaster, right? Don't forget them, because if you lose your house, it doesn't matter how many other people lose your house. You're still homeless at that moment in time. But for Georgia, it isn't just about when a hurricane makes landfall. We sheltered thousands of people who had to be evacuated from the coast, who had no place else to go, no place else to stay. They needed a safe space. And so we moved into operation along with GEMA to make sure that we could open up shelters all along the Augusta and further inland into Columbus to make sure that we were able to support them. So sometimes the story isn't the damage that the storm makes, it's the pre-landfall, making sure that people have a safe place to seek refuge and that they're able then to return to their home after the fact. We wouldn't be here if we didn't tell you you need to take steps. Hurricane season is not over. It doesn't end till the last day of November. We still have late storms. It wasn't too long ago we had one, that hit the Northeast. That was a very, very late storm in the season. So you still have to be prepared, you still have to be vigilant, and you take preparedness actions to make sure that you can take care of yourself, so then you're available to help other people should they need it. And then I'm just going to give one little anecdote here about Maria. So one of the things we get to do in our organization, which I feel incredibly lucky to do, is when the American public says, we want to help fund your mission. When we get to the long-term recovery stage, which absolutely is not the sexy part of this response, right? It's when all the media is gone, but it's when the people who need the most help are at that most critical linkage in time. So for us, we're able to stay after that storm has gone by, after the media has left. We're able to look at the local communities and say, tell me what help looks like, right? It may not be a financial assistance. It may not be a tarp for your roof, right? In a lot of places it is, but not everywhere. And so as an organization, we looked at this post-Maria in Puerto Rico and said, how do we help this community become more resilient? How do we support their long-term recovery? So in Puerto Rico, you shelter in schools, right? The schools didn't have access to power or water post-storm. So what we did was we made a huge investment in solar grids. We put those on the tops of schools so that now those are a rallying point, not only for a shelter, but if you choose to go home, you can come back. You can get information, you can charge your cell phone, all of those critical pieces that allow us to move in. The health pillar. So the Puerto Rico is this beautiful island, but it is incredibly mountainous, and it's hard to transverse from one side to the other. They have small, little kind of clusters of health department-like situations. So we could go out and help them educate and make sure that we're getting all the way out into all of the pieces of the island, not just the populated ones or the ones that showed up on MSNBC or CNN. Water was another one. Everybody who saw this. So us making sure that in smaller communities in rural areas that they had solar panels that could run a generator that could pump their water so that those communities had access to safe drinking water post another hurricane response. And then the resiliency pillar. This is one that I think we haven't done enough selling, but it's these micro grants. So if you're a family farmer, right, and your entire economic dependence for your family is you selling small produce in your local area, it's not only how you generate income, but it's how you feed your family, right? These are really, really small micro loans. Nobody's in the business of doing that, right? We saw that was a hole here, and as an organization, we were able to pivot and make sure that we could deliver those kinds of services to those clients. So there's a picture of our solar panels up on some of the roofs that we use, and some of the water locations where we can put some generators in and help people get access to clean and safe drinking water. And that's it for the Red Cross.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Our final presenter this afternoon is Jesse Munoz from Federal Emergency Management Agency. Jesse?
Got to watch that step there and make sure I don't end up off the stage or falling off here. But good afternoon, Jesse Munoz, Mitigation Division Director, Fema Region 4. Fema Region 4 is the southeastern United States. To describe briefly, it consists of 8 states. And as Dr. Shepard pointed out in his briefing there, that the southeastern United States is some of the most active region of the nation there when it comes to disasters, and we can certainly attest to that. Right now, we have, I was looking at the sheet this morning, as far as the disasters just in Region 4, we're working 14 major disasters declarations simultaneously right now, so we're certainly staying busy. Some of them quite major disasters that I'll talk about in just a minute. But we get the question quite often as to, well, how does FEMA get involved? And well, basically, it's governed by the authorities of the Robert T. Stafford Act of 1988, and that one has quite a few provisions, and not only provide for preparedness, but also response, recovery, and mitigation. And recently, there's been some new legislation that has come into play here that I'll also be discussing very shortly. But basically, when as was pointed out by Sarah, is that whenever a state is beyond its capabilities for emergency management or being able to respond properly to a disaster, they turn to the federal government, and that's where FEMA can get involved, starting off with the preliminary damage assessments to see where we're at as far as damages. Then a decision is made by the president whether or not there is enough damage, enough impact there for there to be a presidential major disaster declaration. Of course, there are some thresholds, such as for public assistance. Give you an example for public assistance, and that's the assistance that we provide communities and the state agencies and certain private nonprofit organizations. But there's a threshold that has to be reached. For the state of Georgia in fiscal year 19, it was over $14 million. Once that has that figure, and it can be in some cases, depending on the storm, that threshold can be met quite easily. But anyway, that's with the federal declaration, it basically opens the door to any federal asset that's out there. Whether it's specialized equipment or supplies or manpower or specialized services. Basically, once you have a major disaster declaration, and that allows that aid to come in to minimize or completely eliminate the disaster suffering. Now, we certainly recognize at FEMA that there has been a change in weather patterns over the years. And in fact, over the last 2 years, there's been a 20% increase in the number of major disaster declarations. There's a 20% increase over the previous 5 years that record went unchallenged. But we're certainly seeing more storms, more frequent storms, longer duration, as was pointed out, and we know that we'll continue to see more intense storms and more frequent storms. And so we have taken steps recently, including legislations to help mitigate that. Just to show some of the storms that have impacted Georgia. Still working on Hurricane Irma, and that one which was declared in the fall of 2017. That one, right now, up to date, we're at over $198 million in obligations, in help that we have been providing for the states and local governments, and that is inclusive of the individual assistance program, the assistance that we provide to individuals and households, the public assistance program, again, to help out the states and communities with their infrastructure rebuilding, and also the mitigation program. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program is a program that makes available dollars to help either reduce the risk or completely eliminate the risk for a similar type storm in the future. And certainly for Irma, we have been involved with a lot of acquisitions, otherwise known as buyouts, where we'll work closely with the states and the communities to determine which of those properties will be acquired. Also have been a lot of projects in mitigation have included the elevations of properties to make sure that they are certainly at or above the base flood elevation as depicted on the flood insurance rate maps. Those are some of the most frequent projects, and for those, as far as the acquisitions and also the relocations is where we take a property and relocate it out of a special flood hazard area and move it to a place where there is a lot less risk for flooding, otherwise known as the X zone in the flood insurance rate maps. But in those situations, we, let's say once a property is acquired, it is demolished, and then it is deeded so that there will be no future construction on that piece of property. Therefore, again, that's less that we have to pay for or that the communities have to deal with for future like-type disasters. But also been involved with a number of other type of mitigation events, actions, which include the culvert resizing. We notice a lot of times that the culvert size, culvert pipe might be improperly sized. Therefore, when it reaches the regular 1% chance flood event, the area easily floods. A lot of times that's because of the culvert pipes being improperly sized. That can be mitigated by increasing the culvert size or doing other types of retention ponds, other actions like that that'll help with the flooding situation so that it at least can withstand a 1% chance in any given year as far as withstanding that. Another major disaster that has the other one, too, that affected Georgia, not only did it impact Georgia, it impacted Alabama and South Carolina also, certainly impacted Florida. I'm sure you've seen the pictures of Mexico Beach, how that was impacted. And that storm went on to North Carolina, where it was a tropical storm, but even then it caused enough damage to get a major disaster declaration for all the damage that was caused in North Carolina. So that, but with that, with all the disasters that we've had recently, it has caused the FEMA headquarters to rethink and come up with a new strategy. And the strategy, basically three simple goals. And one is to build a culture of preparedness. The second one is to ready the nation for catastrophic disasters, and third is to reduce the complexity of FEMA. For building a culture of preparedness, one of the things that we are doing is to incentivize investments to reduce the risk. More pre-disaster mitigation is being authorized, and also closing the insurance gap, trying to get more and more people, especially those in a special flood hazard area, to buy that necessary flood insurance to help them recover faster and more thoroughly. To ready the nation for catastrophic disasters, some of the actions that we have taken are that we're assembling teams that are going to be more responsive, such as the National Incident Management Assistance Team. That's one that's certainly one ready to deploy on a moment's notice and help out with the initial coordination once a major disaster is declared. For reducing the complexity of FEMA, that is where we're doing our best and sending out teams out to just inform the public as far as what programs are available in FEMA and how to access them. And but each one of these goals have a number of also given actions there that are taking place. One of the most significant pieces of legislation that has come about just recently has been the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. And that one, with some 56 provisions, mostly for the public assistance program and the mitigation program, it has a number of items to include the what is right now being written is the BRIC program, or otherwise the Building resilient infrastructure and communities. With that program, that's going to open up millions and millions of dollars each year that will be available for communities throughout the nation to compete for mitigation projects to help out prior to a disaster happening. As we see right now, when there's a major disaster, that opens the door to the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. But we see that there's very much a need to have more mitigation dollars before a disaster happens. And with this new BRIC program that will be in place, we feel very confident by 2020 that will certainly help out the nation to become more resilient. Whenever there is a major disaster, there's, of course, the Regional Response Coordination Center, where not only the FEMA staff is deployed there to work 24 hours a day until all the initial coordination for a disaster has taken place, but also we bring on board our emergency support functions. We have experts that come in from, say, the federal, we bring them in from the Federal Communications Commission, from the Department of Transportation, U.S. Department of Transportation, U.S. EPA, the FBI, the IRS, all these experts that help out for the purpose of helping out to minimize disaster suffering. But I'll leave without any further ado, because I know I'm being told it's time. I just want to put in one plug for flood insurance. As the Mitigation Division Director, you know, hey, we have a saying in FEMA, is where it rains, it can flood. And one of the interesting facts too, that just 1 inch of water in an average size home, just 1 inch of water on your floor, it costs an average of $25,000 to repair. So that's just another reason. So if you live in a flood-prone area, and we certainly do anywhere in Georgia, we certainly encourage you to look at flood insurance, either what FEMA has to offer under the National Flood Insurance Program or a private policy. Thank you for your time.
My colleagues did a great job of putting a plug or giving you a homework task. And I have to say, when I look out in this room, all I see is volunteers waiting to happen. So I hope some of you have been inspired to come and be a part of our team. We're running a bit on time behind, so I really want to shift gears now and just go right to an opportunity for us to have some dialogue. Really would like to hear what questions you have. Ian, could you give us a hand, maybe take one of these mics out to folks in the audience? Ian's he is a great volunteer from Emory University. Let's give it up for Ian. Nice job. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
If you could just please state who you are and where you're from, that would help us frame the question.
So my name's Chris Pugel. I'm a student at University of North Georgia, Gainesville. I'm a GIS and biology major.
All right. You sound like our kind of guy.
Yeah. So this is a bit off topic, but I'm curious. After hearing everything you guys said, it sounds incredibly complex and hard to do disaster relief. How do you do this in third or developing countries, and when you don't have strong infrastructure education that we have here, and with global warming making storms more intense and causing things like famine, which God forbid I hope will never happen here, become more prevalent in those areas? What is your plan to deal with the refugee crisis? How are you going to support those people trying to come here or move to other countries? And just like the massive mandate is going to happen from global warming.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Christopher. Mm-hmm. So I'll give a chance to our colleagues to respond as well. But just, in terms of what we're doing is we're focusing on the individual and their families. And it really, if you look at the situation this year with Dorian, it really spared us here in the United States for the most part. But it really took an amazing toll on people in the Bahamas. So the whole country rallies around that. So provides us resources. So we've sent staff from the Red Cross to Bahamas to help directly on the ground, but we're also planning long-term recovery activities for them. So a lot of the principles that we have here in our operations in the United States, we can apply elsewhere around the world, obviously Haiti and a number of other instances where we've gone at scale and our country has gone to support from both domestic responders but international responders as well. So a lot of our principles and the things, how we operate, really transpose any place where there's a crisis and people need help. So we focus on the people that need help and providing them services. I'll check in with my colleagues. Jesse, anything you'd like to add?
Well, first of all, when it comes to FEMA, of course, our authorities only apply for the 50 states and the territories and possessions of the United States. But with that being said, we do offer technical assistance that we've sent out experts. I remember back in, I guess it was 2011, Haiti had a terrible earthquake that happened there. And with that, we sent out experts to help out with the emergency management aspect of it. We've sent out experts after the Fukushima, Japan nuclear disaster there. We sent out our nuclear physicists and other experts there to help out with the technical expertise to make sure that there was a proper recovery being done and that everything was being done right. But we do provide technical assistance around the world whenever it's needed. But as far as any grant dollars, any of our programs only applies to the 50 states and our territories and possessions.
Jennifer, anything you'd like to add?
So yeah, I think one of the sayings is if you've seen one disaster, you've seen one disaster, right? Each one is unique and poses a whole host of complications and opportunities to try new things. The beautiful thing about the Red Cross as an organization is they're sister societies, right? And so each society has an area of specialty. And so we leverage those subject matter experts in deploying just a few staff, because the best volunteer, the most effective volunteer is a local community volunteer, right? They understand the community, they know where the schools are, where people meet, they have the trust. So we're there kind of to advise and support and make sure. The thing that you probably don't think about a lot is we're the recipients of subject matter expertise as well, right? So when Irma hit, we needed places to lodge our volunteers in the Keys. There wasn't any place. There wasn't anything standing that we could put our volunteers in, and we can't ask them to make that huge trek every day down the beautiful bridge, but nonetheless, too long of a commute. So we went to the Danish Red Cross. They build base camps, and they built us a base camp. So we leverage those subject matter expertise, not only us sending expertise out, but we are also the recipients at sometimes as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sarah, anything you'd like to add?
It is on. Okay. Likewise, I mean, Georgia's not going to necessarily deploy. We work within the state of Georgia, but in the disaster field, I mean, this is a relationship field. So when, for example, in the Bahamas, they got hit, we had some of our organizations that are also members of Georgia FOAD deploy there, and they reach out to me if they need connected with other nonprofits that fulfill a certain need. So, for example, they needed warehouse management staff to help with managing donations that were coming in. So I was able to connect them with a partner that we work with that have boots on the ground in the Bahamas. So ultimately, even though we're not deploying physical resources, we can still be a connector in that way.
And just a final note, that was a great question. Thank you for getting us started so well. We did receive evacuees, and with our partners in Florida and other groups, agencies, government, et cetera, we did help evacuees that came to Florida to seek refuge. So thank you for that great question. Who's next?
Hi, Jill Gamble from University of Georgia Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. I had a question about flood insurance. So we heard this morning about how flood risk is increasing due to sea level rise and changing weather patterns, and yet along the Georgia coast, the latest firm maps actually lowered the BFE on average, I think, by 3 feet, meaning that entire neighborhoods are no longer required to maintain flood insurance. I wondered if you have been working at all in the modeling or thinking about how we might reflect the true risk in coastal Georgia through firm maps, and just how you're trying to combat the confusion maybe that's creating amongst residents.
Thank you, Jill. Jesse, can you help us with that?
I'll try to. But first of all, the mapping itself is done by the contractors that FEMA contracts for. And of course, they go with the latest technology as well as the historical data that's used for the technology, that the latest LiDAR technology is used for that. But as far as for the out years, some of the things that come into play are, these flood insurance rate maps are meant to be for a period of, say, 5 to 10 years, thereabouts. We always try to replace our maps within that time period. Yes, some do go beyond that, but I know there's been a lot of discussion as far as, well, should we project it out even further to 50 years, 100 years out, where the coastline might be now 100 feet more inland than it currently is. But those kind of discussions are taking place. But right now we're just dealing with the here and now, as far as what developments are out there, what the flow of the water is going to be like, and to just project what is needed at the current time. But the one thing that we always do in the flood insurance world is that we always say that, hey, even if you are in an X zone, that's an area that's not subject to the 1% chance flood in a given year, then we always tell them, still buy insurance. There's a reduced risk, a reduced cost of what is called a PRP. Sorry, preferred risk policy. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. But we always encourage those to be purchased there to protect them, because even then we could have a storm like South Carolina had in 2015, where that one went way above the 1% chance flood. I think it came out to be like a 750-year flood, and of course there was just not enough flood insurance that had been purchased. Yes, it fared all right along the coast as far as the people that had flood insurance policies, but there was so many more residents that were further inland that had devastating floods. So we always just encourage, always get a preferred risk policy.
That's a great point. I worked on that flooding in 2015, and it was more of an impact in the middle of the state than it was on the coast. So that flood insurance and getting insurance is a great tool for everyone. Thank you for that question, Jill, and thank you, Jesse. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Yes, sir?
Hey, I'm Scott Gunter from Columbus State University. As you may or may not know, the Georgia Climate Project has a list of 40 what we call roadmap climate questions for both for professors, for students. You have a room full now of attentive faculty, graduate students, industry professionals. Can you identify some questions or some of the big questions that we can be working on to best help resiliency for disasters? Hashtag broad question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think we're still grappling with trying to understand not only the storm surge, but the freshwater inundation that may come from the rains behind it, and the meshing of those two problem sets is an area that I know the government is focused on. We are in the Red Cross trying to make sure that we're not just paying attention to the water at risk that's coming from the coast as a result of the hurricane, but what is the flooding that's coming behind it, and do we have adequate controls and measures in place to help us not lose sight or be unaware that we have this great risk also sometimes from the freshwater flooding that comes from behind it. And our experience in Florence with such a slow-moving storm really, I think, brought that to an acute place for us as an agency and for our partners as well. So that's something that occurs to me that might be helpful to have some additional intentionality on. Jesse, any questions you'd like to ask?
The only thing is, what can Congress do to help us out with legislation that would provide for more resiliency? Like I mentioned too, the DRRA, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, was a huge step to help out in the area of resiliency. But maybe there's more legislation that's needed that will provide more programs, more dollars, federal dollars that would be available to help out to make communities more resilient. So that's the only thing that comes to mind right off the top of my head.
That's an excellent question. Jennifer, anything you'd like to add?
I think for us, part of it is maximizing the opportunities that exist. So we find that communities are much more receptive to preparedness messaging, to mitigation messaging post a disaster. There's a small window of time there where communities are really open and receptive to those kinds of messages and the steps they can take as they move forward to be prepared for the next storm. When they've just evacuated, when they didn't know if their house was going to make it, when they thought it might flood, they're going to be more open to that kind of messaging. So some additional education right post-storm, right, as you re-enter into an evacuation zone or as we're coming through, making sure that they understand some of the steps they can take so that next time it's not as stressful, there isn't as much unknown, is a huge opportunity for us. And we try and maximize it, but that really needs to be a whole community kind of response to make sure that people can take those kinds of actions.
Yeah, that's one of those that the big amplifier really helps. We get a lot of voices on that message. That would be helpful. Thank you for that. Sarah?
And I'm thinking more at the lens of, other nonprofits and the partners I look at. And just some backstory, I used to work for the University of Office of Service Learning. So I worked very closely with faculty and students to address community issues, but I think a lot of times community partners don't know how to plug in to those resources. So on their behalf, I'm asking, how can they partner with you to build resiliency within their community? So, and I would go so far as to say that you should go ahead and reach out because they won't always know to reach out to you.
Well, that was a great question. Thank you for that. I think we have maybe time for one last one in the back.
Hi, my name is Alex Muir. I work at a coastal nonprofit in Savannah called 100 Miles. And my question is for you, Jesse. With the BRIC program, will there be a 25% match requirement for those grants like you have with hazard mitigation grants?
Yes, there will be.
Okay, and then to follow up with that, right now in Georgia, please correct me if I'm wrong, I see a lot of that burden falling on local governments to provide that match. And I'm curious, in the rest of Region 4, if you're seeing that burden fall on local governments as well, or if there's state legislation that's been helpful in creating some sort of fund to give that match.
When it comes to major disaster declarations, it varies in our 8 states. Some, the governor puts the burden on the local communities to pick up the entire 25% non-federal share. A lot of our states go with a 12.5 share, and then there's some, it depends on the disaster itself. There will be some that the governor will cover the entire cost of that entire 25% non-federal share. But when it comes to the BRIC program, because it is a pre-disaster program, more than likely it's going to be up to the local communities to come up with their share, that 25% share for the project. And that's, of course, if the project is selected for funding. Because with that, as we see every year with the current pre-disaster mitigation program, all those projects that get selected, of course, it's upon the community to come up with the cost of non-federal share for those projects.
Great question. Thank you very much for asking that. Unfortunately, we really are out of time now. I think we're going to get the hook here in a minute, but I want to thank you guys for being a great audience and for some really outstanding questions there to help us bring our session together to a great end. Many of us will be around at the conference for the next several days, so if there are things that you wanted to ask that we didn't get a chance, we'd love to have that conversation with you at a break or explore some other topics as well. So could you guys please help me thank our panelists?